if you have a few minutes for me today, I would like to talk about the top 10 things I hate about my disability. So at number 10 today of the top 10 things I hate about my disability, I hate that commercial airline travel is not held to the same accessibility standards as other forms of public transportation. The last time that I flew was in 2019. Some friends and I attended a wedding up in Northern California. So we flew from San Diego up to Sacramento. And I'm happy to say that the flight out was entirely uneventful, and that's always everything that you can hope for in air travel, right? But the same cannot be said for the trip back. So, upon return home to San Diego, I was greeted by my electric wheelchair missing its joystick. The joystick that I use to drive and control every function on the wheelchair was actually sitting in the seat of the chair. I was given absolutely no explanation for what happened. I don't have any clue how or why the joystick was damaged and removed, but it happened. And for thousands of people who have their vital mobility equipment, medical equipment damaged every year by airlines, it is not very often that we get any type of answer or explanation for what happened. And then other times we are just left feeling violated and mistreated in many ways. When we talked about airline travel in the US, it is important to note that the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, does provide guidelines for many forms of public transportation, including buses, trains, and trolleys. Airplanes are not covered under the ADA. Airline travel is actually covered under an older piece of legislation, and that legislation is the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986, and that is where a lot of the issues currently lie, because while ADA regulations expanded protections for people with disabilities in so many different public arenas, it failed to address airline travel. And so what that means is that in the year 2023, we are seeing a 108% increase in complaints by flyers with disabilities regarding damage to mobility equipment and injuries that they sustain as a result of flying. Air travel in the US and abroad could be better. It should be better. And so today it is number 10 on my list. Number 9, I hate the government's official definition of disability. So when I call out the government today, I am actually referring specifically to the Social Security Administration, because for so many of us with disabilities in this country, the Social Security Administration is very much the gatekeeper standing between us and so many of the other vital services and programs and resources that we need and rely on every single day. So, the definition that the Social Security Administration chooses to use has very strong and complicated implications on us as individuals. So I would like to go over the actual definition that the Social Security Administration uses, and it is a long one, and it is pretty packed, so we're going to take a moment to dissect it together. So according to the Social Security Administration, the basic definition of disability goes as follows. The law defines disability as the inability to do any substantial gainful activity by reason of any medically determinable physical or mental impairment which can be expected to result in death, or which has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. Talked about a simple definition. So the problem that I have with this definition of disability is that it combines a physical and mental impairment with an inability to perform any substantial gainful activity, meaning employment. By fusing these two concepts together, you make it impossible to separate them. And what I mean by that is, using myself as an example, obviously I have conspicuous disabilities. I use an electric wheelchair to move. I use a trach and ventilator to breathe. I have incredibly limited physical strength and stamina. For me, that is all very visible from the outside. I don't have to spend basically any amount of time explaining to anyone my physical limitations because they're visibly obvious. That being said, there is no reason to assume that I am either not interested in working or unable to work, right? I am a reasonably educated adult woman who has a huge number of interests and qualities to share with others, and I am entirely capable of performing meaningful work and services for the community that I live in and care about. And this herein lies the problem. Obviously, I am disabled and I am capable of working. Those two facts are absolutely true for me. According to this definition, however, I cannot be able and willing to work and be disabled. So in order to qualify for the medical and care benefits that I need to live safely in my home with my disabilities, I am prohibited from working largely in the way that the government regards as significant and meaningful. So I have a problem with this. By attaching an individual's interest or ability to work with their physical or mental limitations or considerations, you are essentially prohibiting a huge part of the population from providing for themselves and their families. You are isolating people from having access to financial stability and growth, and you are really undermining the constructs of equality when you imply that any person who is willing and able to work is simply basically excluded from the workforce because of an arbitrary definition of disability. Number 8, I hate that public education is not fully integrated for students with disabilities. So I will preface this point today by conceding that I understand that there are efforts that are being made and that need to continue to be made to make public education in the US more equal and equitable for all students, no matter the minority group that they belong to, no matter where they happen to live. There are huge gains that still need to be made for the quality of public education in this country for minority students. I understand that many of these issues are not unique to students with disabilities. That being said, the conversation around public education and minority students tends to leave out students with disabilities. So let's shine a light on that today. So like so many other causes in this country, the integration of public schools for students with disabilities was the direct result of the civil rights movement. So all the way back in 1954, the Supreme Court had a landmark ruling on the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. And so in that ruling, the Supreme Court held that separate education for African American children was not an equal education. And that ruling provided a precedent to integrate public education for all American citizens. Of course, however, it would take at least another 20 years for the public schools to open their doors for students with disabilities. Today, our separate but equal education system takes the form of quote-unquote special education classes for students with disabilities and quote-unquote regular education classes for mainstream students. Obviously, if we go back to the Supreme Court ruling where Chief Justice Earl Warren said himself, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So that begs the question, how can we regard special ed programs as quality public education when the Supreme Court has clearly ruled that separate facilities are inherently unequal? Another thing that I hate is that quality disability representation is still lacking in mainstream media and culture. So when I think back to my childhood, there were very few characters with disabilities that I remember. The majority of these characters were in comedy roles. These characters were often used as props, or I should say as vehicles to get a laugh. They were not terribly well written or in-depth characters most of the time. And one thing that I do remember is that when disability was represented honestly and openly, it was through the lens of charity or from a medical perspective or a lens of lacking in some significant way. And I know for myself, I would have benefited from seeing children who looked like me on camera. It would have been so meaningful and encouraging for me to have mentors to be able to identify adults with disabilities who may look like me or share a similar experience as me. And I, of course, would have benefited from having those references and influences in my life, because we all need representation. Every single person on this planet needs to feel that they identify with a group that they share qualities with other people and that they matter. But if you don't see yourself in public, if you don't see yourself occupying spaces, then you might never know that you can. You might never know that that's an option for you. A couple startling statistics to drive this home today. 95% of all characters with disabilities on television today are played by non-disabled actors. This is hilarious to me because I know a few disabled actors that are biting at the bit for roles, right? I mean, everyone needs a job. It is not that there is a lack of interested actors out there. They are just not being chosen for the roles written for them, I suppose. That's interesting. Number 6. I hate that in 2023, universal design practices have yet to be implemented nationwide. Universal design concepts promote accessibility for all. Universal accessibility means acknowledging the rights of people affected by various barriers imposed by the environment and the advantages that accessibility offers to everyone, regardless of their situation. Universal design is really about accepting the fact that our physical environment can be barrier-free for all. Instead of addressing accessibility concerns according to specific disabilities or limitations, why don't we look at our public spaces and the way we design public buildings and public spaces to be inclusive and welcoming to people? This isn't just about ramps. This is about eliminating unnecessary barriers that don't serve anyone. An example that I would use would be, instead of building the stairs first and adding the ramp as an afterthought later, why don't you build the ramp first and the building becomes accessible to everyone? It's not complicated. It's not a new concept. It's just needing to recognize the barriers that currently exist for a huge number of people in this country and considering creative and really practical solutions to address those barriers so that everyone benefits. Number 5. I hate that there is an overarching lack of awareness and support for disabled individuals seeking vital services. So obviously, many of us face barriers accessing healthcare, quite literally. Barriers that we might come up against can include physical barriers relating to entering a clinic or medical facility. There can be a lack of accessible equipment. Another major issue that I've come up against personally is, a lack of a safe method for transferring me as the patient to an examination table. And a lot of times there can just be a general lack of policies and awareness, either on the part of medical staff, at the facilities, and a lot of issues like that. But also, when I talked about a lack of awareness and support for disabled people in their efforts to access services, another major issue is the entire process of applications of recertification. Any number of forms that require being filled out. There's an extensive amount of reading and processing involved. A lot of times with applications and renewals, and it can be an incredibly stressful and confusing and disheartening process to try to maintain and access very important and necessary services. Number 4, I hate that the mental health needs of disabled people are largely overlooked and are outright denied by mainstream medical constructs. Considering that adults with disabilities are reported to experience mental distress almost 5 times as often as adults without disabilities, it is incredibly disturbing to me that mental health is generally entirely overlooked for people with disabilities. Not only do adults with disabilities frequently lack access to healthcare due to any number of barriers, including the cost related to mental health care, they're also likely to live well below the federal poverty line. So given that people with disabilities have limited access to income and resources, the high costs associated with mental health care are just too much, and that is a huge barrier to overcome. Another issue for so many of us is that we are simply exposed to more stresses. Let's be real. I am confronted by all of the same stresses as everyone else. And then let's add on a few. So not only are many of us confronted on a daily basis with the physical barriers of our environment, we are also bombarded with negative stereotypes, with prejudice and judgment and biases around disabilities and chronic illness, and that can really take its toll on us mentally. Without going into too much detail, I had an experience with a psychologist at one point on my mental health journey, and at the end of my session with this person, it was our first session together. We were just introducing ourselves, and I certainly was just beginning to get comfortable with this person. And they came out and asked me a very private medical related question that was completely inappropriate in the context of our conversation. And the result of that encounter was that I did not seek mental health services again for another 3 years. I shut down and did not obviously go back to that counselor, and I struggled for a long time until I was ready to try again. And luckily I did, because the next experience was very positive and very helpful. But, conflicts like that happen where a person with any disability may feel called out, left out, or otherwise discriminated against in the process of accessing mental health services, and that is simply unacceptable. Number 3, I hate that American culture equates national pride with physical prowess. If one more person talks about pulling themselves up by their bootstrap, I might strangle them with their bootstrap. No, of course not. But this one is probably a little more personal than some of the other topics on my list today, because I can fully appreciate and celebrate any person who is willing and able to look beyond their own limitations and imagine potential. If you are able to suppress your own limiting beliefs and your own past experiences long enough to imagine a better way, then I am always here for it. I will support that and help foster that growth and that imagination and that progress in any way that I can. What I'm talking about here is the tendency that we have as Americans to idolize a very specific type of independence, right? I mean, we want to believe that we are all capable of inventing entirely new realities alone. Really, I mean, so many of our stories, so many of our heroes as a culture really go above and beyond to prove everyone wrong and excel in a way that is very exclusionary in a sense, if you think about it. And that's the part that I have a hard time with. Because growing up, I can tell you that, well, I have always loved my country and I have always been grateful and proud to live in the US. Growing up, I did not feel included or involved in that version of the American dream. And I think part of it was because I understood at a young age that I needed help and I needed support to thrive. And generally speaking, the American conversation around that is charity and needing and existing on what is given to you. And that is a very different conversation than the one that is offered to quote-unquote able-bodied Americans. Number 2, I hate that sexual identity, sexual pleasure, and other sex-positive topics are largely overlooked and or outright denied to disabled people by mainstream culture. We've already covered the fact that approximately 1/4 of the general population is living with some form of disability at the moment. For so many of us, we are seen and regarded as children, not only by the general public, but by representations of us on television. When this happens, when we are not acknowledged or recognized for being fully capable, autonomous adults with the same interests and rights to our bodies as everyone else, there's a problem. And so too often we are viewed as asexual beings who are either incapable or uninterested in sex or sexual relations with a partner, and that is incredibly disturbing. Obviously, a disability does not preclude anyone from expressing themselves or their needs in a healthy, consensual way, and it is a disservice to everyone to deny sex-positive content and conversations to people with disabilities, because not only does sex play into physical health, it plays into mental health, and every single person deserves the right to explore and entertain their interests and their needs, no matter who they are. Last but not least today, number 1, I hate the prevailing assumptions around caregiving and care receiving encourage really negative feelings such as being a burden, having a lack of self-worth, and other issues. So as someone who has relied on the care and support of my family and friends and professional caregivers my entire life, I can tell you that it is not uncommon to have moments when I feel like I am a burden. And this is not to say that it is intentional on the part of my caregivers, but that is a very real feeling that so many of us have. And so why might we feel like a burden, right? The moments that I feel like an imposition on someone else, those are the moments where I know that someone is helping me at their own expense. For instance, I can tell you there was a time in high school that I did not have a caregiver lined up to take me to class. On those days, my mom had to take off of work. She is a retired kindergarten school teacher. And so she had to take days off from work to attend high school with me so that I didn't have to miss out on my own experiences. And so, of course, in that moment, I recognized that it wasn't necessarily right that my mom would have to miss work making money for our household so that she could stay home and take care of me. And in that situation, it would be very hard for me not to acknowledge that and not to appreciate the sacrifice of my caregiver. But breaking it down, I have to recognize that my mother should not have been in that position in the first place, right? In the US, we generally undervalue caregiving as a profession. We have relegated it to the obligation of women primarily in the household. We view women as natural caregivers, and so we assume that they are ready, willing, and able to put aside their own interests and goals and needs in order to take care of others when the time comes. And this is a disservice to especially workers who should be valued and compensated accordingly for their skills and commitment and everything else that they go through. And we should also value the engagement of the people receiving care. This is not an unhealthy dynamic. This can be a beautiful and healthy dynamic where people who need care are able to receive it and benefit from quality professional services, while the people providing the necessary care are valued and appreciated and compensated accordingly. If we have learned anything from the pandemic in the past 3 years, I hope that it is that we have to reevaluate who we consider essential workers. How many thousands of people were forced out of the labor market, out of their jobs, out of meaningful employment because they had to remain at home and isolate and become caregivers for family members, for friends and loved ones. So please, there's no reason to feel like a burden if I know my caregivers are cared for and respected and appreciated and compensated accordingly. And so that should be the goal.